essentially what I want to talk to you about is that I believe elephants are smart. We've sort of gradually over the last 20 to 30 years been gathering quite a lot of interesting evidence, particularly about savanna elephants in Africa. And that's what I want to start off by talking to you about today, is giving you an overview of some of that work that's been done with savanna elephants that leads us to this conclusion that elephants are in fact quite smart. I mean, you may not be surprised by this sort of belief that I have. I think quite a lot of people do tend to think that elephants are pretty smart. And I think one of the reasons for that is probably that elephants do seem to have a sort of the architecture for intelligence. They seem like they should be an intelligent species based partly on their size. Obviously, within that large body and that very large head is a large brain. In physical terms, it's the largest brain of any land mammal, weighing about 6.5 kilos. Human brain weighs about 3 to 3.5, I think. Elephants are also very highly social. They're very long-lived. So living more than 60 years is not unusual in natural populations. And they have this very long period of juvenile dependency, so essentially a long childhood. So presumably sort of lots of time and opportunity to learn from the other elephants around them. Before we move on to specific evidence, I just want to give a very brief overview of that complex sociality that I mentioned, these sort of complex social lives that elephants live in, because this is important, and it's sort of, we've used this in a lot of the studies of elephants, sort of manipulate this, not manipulate the social, but sort of take advantage of this complicated social setting in order to try and understand a little bit more about the elephant intelligence. So the basic unit of elephant social structure, savanna elephant social structure, I should be clear about that, is the mother and unit calf, mother-calf unit, sorry. So you have mother and her calf, and that's sort of the basic structure. But a mother and her calf will tend to group within their family. So other individuals related to that adult female will all hang together in a family. And that family group is very closely bonded. They spend a lot of their time together, not necessarily all of their time. They can split and come back together, but the family group is the sort of group level that we're talking about with elephants. And then different families can group together in sort of higher order structures to make bond groups, or clans, even higher still. But if you think about the sort of mother-calf unit and the family as being central to elephant society. A lot of the work I'm going to talk about today has been conducted in Amboseli National Park, working in partnership with the Amboseli Trust for Elephants, which is a really extraordinary and amazing organisation started by Cynthia Moss, who's shown in the bottom right there, back in 1972. So we've now got 54, 55 years worth of data from this one population of elephants. That population is currently just over 2,000 elephants, but over the history of the study, they've known and identified and been following thousands of individual elephants. So it really is an extraordinary research database, research resource, and I feel incredibly lucky to have been able to work there. And a lot of the work I'm going to present, even if it's not been done by me, has been done in Amboseli or at one other site in Kenya called Samburu, which is run by an organisation called Save the Elephants. So without those two institutions, we wouldn't know a fraction of the stuff that I'm about to present to you. So I think the first thing we can say about elephant intelligence is they have pretty extraordinary social knowledge. And this was first tested by one of my mentors, Karen McComb, working in Amboseli. Karen took advantage of the fact that elephants tend to like to stay in contact with each other by making these rumble contact calls. So it's this very low, long duration, low frequency rumble sound that elephants make when they're apart from each other, and it's a means of staying in contact with their family. So as I said, when a family tends to split apart for a little while, but they can remain in vocal contact with each other. So Karen recorded quite a lot of these contact calls from different individuals and then played them back to different groups. As she was playing back whether playing them back to groups that were closely associated with the person who made the call, or groups that were much less associated with the individual that made the call. I realize I just called an elephant a person. I will do that a lot. I apologize, but they become people in my head. And Karen showed very clearly that when you play back these contact calls to other elephants, the individuals who are hearing the call can differentiate between individuals that they know, that they're familiar with and or closely associated to, and individuals that are strangers. So it seems very apparent that from just the sound of the voice essentially only, the elephants were able to tell who they knew and who they didn't, much like we can tell the difference between a voice that we're familiar with and a voice that we've not heard before from someone talking. And interestingly, Karen did find that there was some variation in this, that some families were better at this than others. And that's a point I'm going to come back to later, but for now I'm just going to gloss over that. Really interestingly, more recent studies, again using these contact calls from elephants. Mickey Pardo, working with George Whitmire in Samburu, also in Kenya, has shown that actually it seems like these contact calls have some sort of individually specific component to them. So that whenever an elephant is talking to Eudora over there, they use the same kind of call, some elements of that call that they're using to contact Eudora are the same, whoever is making the call. So there seem to be individually specific calls that they use to address each other. And Mickey and George suggested that this functions really quite a lot like the names that we use for each other. So it's not that I always say use this word to talk to this elephant and that word to talk to that elephant. It's that all elephants use this word to talk to her and all elephants use that word to talk to her. They discovered this using a sort of combination of machine learning, so modeling the calls that they'd recorded, and then playing those calls back to the elephants and determining the different responses that the elephants made. And with those two approaches, they were able to show that yes, it does seem that elephants do have these individually specific or name-like calls for each other. And that's not been shown for any other species so far other than humans, which is pretty remarkable. It's also been shown that elephants have pretty human-like skills in other forms of communication. So one of a PhD student I've been working with, Vesta Eleuterai, has shown that elephants tend to use gestures in the same way that we do, in the sense that if you think when you're using gestures as you're speaking, you tend to respond to the audience, you respond to how much attention someone's giving you. And if they're not paying you visual attention, you might tap them on the shoulder and ask them to turn around and look at you, for example. Or if they look as though they're not really following what you're saying, you might elaborate what you're saying or how you're gesturing in order to get your point across. And in a couple of different studies looking at elephant-to-elephant communication and also elephant-to-human communication, Vesta was able to show that elephants do much the same. So they respond to the attention of the audience and they elaborate what they're doing or the gestures that they're using when it seems like they've been misunderstood. So I think in a number of different ways, we're building a picture that elephants have this very impressive communicative abilities in terms of name-like calls and how they can use gestures and target their communication appropriately based on the audience and the responses of their audience. Some of my early work with elephants, we've also shown that elephants can recognize individuals, that they know individuals, and they can do that based on the scent of those individuals. So, for example, we people tend to know each other by sight or by voice, perhaps, but elephants can also do that based on the scent of others. And more importantly, that they can keep track of the location of those others in their family. And we did that by setting up an experiment using urine. So you see in the picture there, that's me in the very glamorous role of collecting a urine sample that an elephant had just deposited on the grass. Obviously, I would take a note of who had urinated, collect the sample, and then hope that the right conditions would present itself, that I could then use that sample in an experimental trial. We did various different trials in this study, but the sort of most exciting one to talk about today is this setup, vaguely explained by this diagram here. So you'll notice in the photograph that elephants, when they're walking along in their family group, they tend to walk in single file and sort of a long spread out line. And often that group might become sort of a little bit separated. So you have some moving and then quite a gap, and then some more moving at the back. And that was the particular setup that we were hoping to encounter. And what we would then do is wait for an elephant in that second group, the group further towards the back, to urinate. I would then collect the sample of urine, and we would then drive that sample of urine to the front, where the X at the bottom right-hand corner is shown, deposit the sample in front of the path that the elephants were walking along, and observe their reactions to it. And it was very clear from their reactions that those elephants at the front, as they passed over the sample that we just deposited there, were very surprised. They were very surprised by the response to that urine sample. And based on the various control conditions we had, we reasoned that the only reason those elephants were surprised is because they knew that the elephant who had made that sample was walking behind them. So how could her urine now be in front of me? So that suggested to us that these elephants are not only aware of who's in their group and can recognize the individuals, they are really keeping track of where that individual is in relation to them. And this seemed impressive to me even back in 2008 when I did this study, but since having children of my own and trying to keep track of them around a supermarket, for example, I'm even more impressed that the elephant's ability stretches this far. In groups of sort of 20 to 30 individuals, they can keep track of where every other elephant is in relation to themselves, it would seem. So yes, from that study, we concluded that elephants both recognize their individual family members from urine samples and are keeping track of the position of those individuals. Very quickly, we've also done some analyses looking at empathy and social understanding in elephants, using the observational data and the records that have been collected by the Amboseli elephant group over the last 50 years. And from various different descriptions and our analyses of the way elephants were behaving to each other, it became very apparent that the elephants help each other a lot. You can see just two examples here, for example, of helping cars out of banks or that are stuck in mud. But there's lots and lots of different examples of elephants helping each other, but not just helping each other in a vague general way, but in a very targeted, specific way that is really appropriate to the problem that the individual elephant is facing. And we suggested that implies that elephants can understand the emotions and the goals of others, which again is not necessarily as common an ability in the animal kingdom as you might think, but is something that our social life and our interactions with other people is very heavily dependent on. So there are hints that elephants may understand emotions and goals and have the sort of empathic abilities in much the same way that humans do, though perhaps not to quite the same extent. We've also done some work on environmental knowledge. So everything I've been talking about so far is really looking at the sort of the social knowledge, the social intelligence of elephants. But we also wanted to understand a bit more about what they know about their environment, and particularly what they know about threats in their environment. So the elephants in Amboseli, where I've been working mostly, do seem to have a particular fear of Maasai warriors. You see in the photo there, it's a friend of mine called David, at a warrior ceremony for the Maasai. And you'll notice in the background, and he himself are wearing these red cloths, this red shuka, which is very characteristic of the Maasai warriors. We compared, again, working in the scent domain, compared the reactions of elephants to the scent of these Maasai warriors, to the scent of Kamba men, So Kamba are a different ethnic group living in the same area of southern Kenya, but they're typically typically agriculturalists, whereas the Maasai are pastoralists and cattle herders. Um, and also we compared the reactions to the scent of unworn red garments as well. So in this experiment, we would essentially take one of these red garments that had either been worn by a Maasai warrior, by a Kamba man, or that hadn't been worn at all. And we would drive out, depending on the direction of the wind, we would place the cloth out on a bush, so the elephants couldn't really see it, but when the wind blew, it would carry the scent towards them. And we then measured the responses of the elephants to those scents that they were receiving on the wind from the cloth. Now, I did just try these videos and it did work. So hopefully this will work. So in this video, I'm just going to move it forward to start it because there's quite a lot of not much happening at the beginning. From around here, you'll see one elephant has its trunk up in the air, which was the sign that the elephant had detected the scent, had detected the signal. The second elephant has its trunk up. This presentation was a cloth that had been worn by the Kamba man. So you see the elephants are lifting their trunks, they're sniffing, they're a little bit wary. And after 20 seconds or so after first detecting the scent, first visibly detecting the scent, they move off reasonably fast, but it's not sort of extreme panic moving away from the scent of the Kamba men. In this video clip, I'll show you how they respond when they detected a cloth that had been worn by a Maasai warrior. If the video will work. So here, play the video from here. So you can see the first trunk goes up and immediately the elephants are moving away. Sorry, the video quality is quite poor, but you can see from the amount of dust being kicked up there that they're moving very fast away from the scent of those Maasai. And they kept running until they reached long grass, usually more than a kilometre away. And it would take them a bit longer to relax after smelling the scent of Maasai than it did the cloth that hadn't been worn or the cloth that had been worn by Kamba men. So this graph just demonstrates that result, that essentially when we presented a cloth that was worn by Kamba men to them or a cloth that was worn by Maasai men, the time it took them to first detect it didn't really change, but they moved much faster, much further, and took longer to relax if that cloth had been worn by a Maasai man, which shows us that elephants are able to detect a more predatory ethnic group from a less predatory ethnic group. They can differentiate between the threat levels posed by different ethnic groups and respond appropriately based on scent cues alone. I'm not sure if I said at the beginning, the Maasai in this area, although they tend to live very harmoniously with the elephants, or as harmoniously as possible, historically, traditionally, it was part of a sort of a warrior coming of age was to spear an elephant. And there is some conflict ongoing between the Maasai herders and with their cattle and elephants over resources in the area. So that's why they have this fear of Maasai, and they're able to detect Maasai based on their scent cues alone. Then Karen McComb, who also did the contact call work, also looked at predatory threats. And apart from humans, the only other real predator for elephants is lions. And Karen McComb played back lion roars, and she played back either male or female lions, and if it was either just one lion or several lions together, and measured the responses. And again, I don't think the sound is working for you on this. So I'll tell you when the lion's roaring in the background. So they're playing back a roar from a lion there, and you see the elephants are pausing. They pause, they listen. The lion roar is ongoing. And then the elephants start to bunch together in this defensive formation. You'll notice the calves, the small individuals, sort of get bunched in the middle to protect them, because calves are much more vulnerable to lions than the adults are. So Karen was able to look at those different responses to the different elephants and assess how much the elephants understood about this threat, who was the most sort of predatory, and sort of any nuances in how they understood and responded to this. So again, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but it becomes very clear that as well as this really interesting and advanced, we can use that word, kind of social knowledge, elephants also have very clear discriminatory abilities that allow them to really adapt to their environment and understand or respond appropriately to their predators. But for me, what I think is the most interesting part about all of this stuff that I've spoken about so far is an observation that was made across a few different of these studies, and that is that elders know best. You may have heard this already about elephants, but essentially the groups that are led by an older individual, the older matriarch, tend to do much better. So in Karen McComb's work with the contact calls, she showed that the families that were led by the older matriarchs had better discrimination of those contact calls. So they responded more appropriately and were just better able to tell if the contact call was coming from someone familiar to them or not familiar to them. And it seems even that the time they saved in sort of knowing how to respond, not worrying about the ones that they were familiar with, actually translated into better calf survival or increased calf birthing rates. Karen's work with the lions that I just showed you also showed that, again, there was this age effect. So the families that were led by older matriarchs showed more adaptive defensive behavior, more appropriate responses to the lions. So the families with the older matriarchs were much more likely to ignore or waste less time on a single female lion roaring, because that isn't really much of a threat to an elephant group. Whereas if there were several male lions roaring, it was the older females only that seemed to acknowledge that that was a bigger threat, a more pressing situation, and would respond appropriately by bunching defensively in that way that I showed you. And there's also other work with sort of observational work looking at calf survival rates during droughts in Tanzania. And again, evidence to suggest that the families that had access to these older matriarchs had greater calf survival, so their calves did better during the droughts. And the prediction there is that it's because these families with the older matriarchs had memories of the last really severe droughts, and so were able to lead their family to water sources much further away that younger matriarchs, younger families, didn't actually know existed. I think this sort of concept for me that elders know best is becoming increasingly prevalent as my daughter turns 13. It has no acknowledgement of the fact that perhaps sometimes older people might know a little bit more than she does. That might be familiar to some of you, I don't know. So after that, as I say, very whistle-stop tour of sort of what we know about elephant intelligence, I want to think a little bit more now about why that matters. Why does any of this matter, that elephants might be intelligent and that elders might be particularly important in elephant society? Well, I think that in particular, that elder elephants are important, will have important implications for elephant populations. If you think, for example, is it important that we lose if elders are lost to elephant society? We can, unfortunately, answer that question quite clearly, because it's generally the elders of elephant societies that are targeted by, for example, poachers or ivory trophy hunters, because elephant tusks grow throughout their life. So the older elephants tend to have the larger tusks. that are desired by poachers and trophy hunters. So those individuals are essentially can be selectively removed from populations, unfortunately, allowing us to then see what happens in those populations. So there's been various sort of bits of work done on this over the years. And I recently, with some colleagues, conducted a review of all that different work to essentially try and answer the question, do elephant populations need their elders and an intact society in order to function and behave appropriately? So we conducted a review of how different elephant societies respond when these elders, these potentially sort of knowledgeable individuals, are taken out of their population. We reviewed 95 research papers out of, I think it was about 4,000 that were originally sort of thrown up to us that fit our criteria, and that mentioned deaths from or removals of different forms. Some were natural deaths of elders, some were about poaching, some were about hunting, some were about translocation, so when elephants have been moved to different populations. So it covered a whole range of different reasons, and across forest elephants, savanna elephants, which is what I primarily study, and also Asian elephants. And it became pretty clear from that review that yes, there are consequences of losing elders in elephant populations. There are demographic and fitness consequences. So, for example, the structure of an elephant population pretty obviously changes when you take out those elders. But that has further implications downstream in that it often then, by removing the elders, you often see changes in the reproductive rates of the individuals that are left, and greater calf mortality in the individuals that are left. So without having the elders in the population, other elephants often reproduce less often, although in a few slightly odd cases, they actually can reproduce more often, but the calves that are left are more likely to die. There are also these social consequences as well of removing elders, particularly social cohesion reduces. So the sort of just the glue tying family groups together seems to decrease, and the family unit is less cohesive. And again, as I say, the calf survival is likely to go down, but also the calves that do remain, if those calves are orphans, if those are the calves of elders that have been killed or removed, those individuals grow up with quite severe social costs as well. Essentially, they're sort of pushed to the outskirts of the family group somewhat, which has implications for their situation as well. It's not all bad, I should say. There does seem to be some resilience within elephant populations to losing elders. So Jemima Scrace, who was one of my PhD students, who she passed her PhD over the summer, she's been looking specifically at the leadership of matriarchs and the effects of sort of age and experience on social functioning, working specifically in Samburu with the Save the Elephants group that I mentioned. And her conclusions from across her different studies is that there are other elephants within a family unit that can make decisions when the matriarch is not there. And that actually this influence of age, this influence of being an elder and having the experience isn't all pervasive. There are situations when the younger elephants can manage perfectly fine on their own. So, for example, in one playback study that Jemima ran, here in a similar situation with the Maasai and Amboseli, but in Samburu, it's Samburu pastoralist herders. And there can be quite a lot of conflict or contesting water resources, for example. And Jemima was aware that the Samburu herdsmen can give a particular call, a very specific call to try and push elephants away from a water source when they want to bring their cattle down to drink, for example. And when she played back that call to different elephant groups, the elephants were always good at recognizing that call, understanding what it means, and moving away from the area. It didn't matter if the matriarch wasn't there. It didn't matter if the matriarch wasn't very old. It didn't matter if the other elephants that were there weren't very old. They all seemed to understand that this means I should get out of here. So of course, we're not saying that family groups without an elder present are useless. There is some resilience there. But, another but, other work done by Graham Shannon and Karen McComb again suggests that it's the more nuanced decisions. It's the more fine scale, fine detail discrimination that is the problem for family groups that haven't got an elder matriarch. So Graham's work, for example, compared the responses of elephants in Amboseli in Kenya, the site we've been talking about, which has a very stable, well-protected population structure. So there are a number of families with very old leaders, and a lot of families with reasonably experienced and older females. And he compared the responses both to the contact call playbacks and lion roaring playbacks to the responses of elephants that were based in a reserve called Pilanesberg in South Africa. And the reserve in South Africa called Pilanesberg, the elephant population there was founded by juveniles, so young elephants that were removed after culling operations. So culling operations in South Africa would come along, kill a whole load of adult elephants on the grounds that there were too many elephants in an area, but they would save the calves and then sell them on to different reserves to start new elephant populations. So the Pilanesberg population was founded by some of these cull orphans. I think when it started, the oldest elephant that was around was 8 years old. And if you think the life history of elephants is pretty similar to humans, sexual maturity between 10 to 15, social maturity probably not till 20 to 30 years old. But these populations, the eldest individual available when they were first moved there was 8. In that population, in Pilanesberg, that was founded by these juveniles, the responses to the contact calls of other elephants and the predatory threat from the lion roars were different, very different, and essentially poorer, much less well adapted than the responses that we saw in Amboseli. So it seems to be very strong evidence that in these populations without the elders and without a sort of normal functioning society in which to grow up and learn stuff, you just don't do as well at these fine scale discriminations. So understanding that I don't have to respond to that call because I know who that individual is, or that lion roaring is not a threat, but this one is because it's a male. It's those sort of more nuanced decisions that these family groups seem to be less good at dealing with when they didn't have an elder present. At the time when Graham did these studies, obviously the elephants had aged somewhat since they've been there. So I think the eldest was then in her late 20s or 30s, but it's still not that old for an elephant. And obviously they'd grown up in pretty weird circumstances. So so Graham concluded that these females in these disrupted societies were worse at these nuanced decisions. You might still be thinking, I mean, I began this section by saying, why does this matter? And you might still be thinking, well, that's all very interesting, but again, why does it really matter? Why do we really care beyond it being interesting for the sake of elephants? My argument, my take on this is that it actually has pretty substantial implications for conservation and the management of elephants. I mean, obviously, if you think about it, elephants don't live in a vacuum. You know, there is increasing conflict with humans, between humans and elephants throughout their ranges, across African range states and in Asia. elephants breaking fences, elephants destroying crops, elephants destroying infrastructure. And elephants, particularly, in East and Southern Africa, kill many people every year and inflict thousands, millions dollars worth of damage to people's property and can ruin their livelihoods. So there is a problem between humans and elephants currently. Obviously, part of that is probably due to expanding human populations or moving into areas that previously elephants didn't have to deal with people, but now they do. But what I find interesting about all of this is that not all elephants engage in this kind of behavior. Only some break fences or only some raid crops, but it's not yet clear which elephants do it or why the ones that don't do it, why they don't do it. And that's one of the questions that is sort of inspiring a lot of our work at the moment, I think. There's also, elephants can also be pretty dangerous for tourists and other animals, as well as the local people that are living alongside elephants in these areas. I should just mention that, in the picture here of the elephant rubbing its belly on the Volkswagen Golf car, the people in this car were fine. They were not harmed at all. But in the particular location where this photo was taken, that is not always the case. Elephants have flipped cars, they have crushed cars, they have unfortunately killed some tourists in this area. And there are a few locations where actually these heightened levels of aggression and attacks on tourists do happen. I feel like even this year there have been several in the news already, which you may have seen. These things, I don't know if they're becoming more common, but they're certainly becoming more reported. People are becoming more aware of them. And there's some evidence, some anecdotal evidence to suggest that it's these more heavily disturbed or these more heavily disrupted populations where this kind of aggression is more likely or more frequent. So there's populations where the elders are missing, the population structure has been messed around with and heavily disrupted. And that's where you seem to be getting more aggressive acts being conducted by the elephants. It's probably not quite such a simple story. There are many other factors going on, the way those elephants are managed, I think. But I think it's worth investigating and worth trying to understand this a little bit more. Essentially, my argument is that by disrupting populations and taking elders out of elephant societies, it could well be the case that we're taking away opportunities for elephants to learn appropriate behavior, and that we're essentially altering their behavior or encouraging this sort of poorer social function or maladaptive responses to people and their environment, because we have removed those sort of role models from their society. So that's essentially what I and my PhD students are currently working on, looking at questions like, this is some of the students I'm working with at the moment. Is for example the conflict behavior with humans, is that learned, or can we predict which elephants might engage in this kind of conflict? Can we work out what predicts these high levels of aggression in certain individuals or certain populations? And is any of that related to this idea that when we disrupt or severely alter the elephant population structure, does that have an impact? Are we creating problems for ourselves in some way? So that really was a whistle-stop very fast tour. I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the partners I work with, different elephant research groups and the funding bodies that have been supporting the work that we're doing. And thank you very much for listening.